Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for being here today, and to our friends on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us as well. Today, we are excited to have with us the New Bedford Whaling Museum to talk about a day in the life of a whaling voyage. But first, I'd like to give a little back history on the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Historically, whaling was an essential economic driver for our port communities and also for a rapidly expanding and industrializing society. The wealth and economic capacity generated by whaling fueled the growth and diversity of the South Coast region. Founded as part of the Old Dartmouth Historical Society in 1903, the museum's rich history reveals an intimate relationship with the communities it serves. Motivated by civic pride and a desire to preserve the artifacts and narratives of the region, the museum was established by a deeply engaged group of citizens to create and foster an interest in the history of the area. Today, the museum plays a critical role as champions for whale preservation and guardians of heritage and culture. Through partnerships and collection, the museum stands as an institution for learning from, teaching about, and reflecting on humans' collective impact in the community. Their expanding reach as a cultural and scientific leader can be seen in their growing scholarship, research, and increased presentations of fine art. As a compelling destination that anchors a national park and vibrant urban seaport, they encourage the exploration of the region's cultural, artistic, historic, and scientific contributions. A keeper of the region's collective memory, the museum preserves a communal story of the many who settled in the city that lit the world, and of those who keep the light shining brightly today. Without further ado, may I present Nancy Gentile and Captain Mike Taylor.
As I was hearing that introduction, it made me stand taller and taller. Okay, so today Mike and I are going to alternate and talk about the history of the Lagoda. And then briefly, after we discuss Jonathan Bourne, who owned the Lagoda amongst a few other investors, Mike is going to discuss the captain and the crews. I'm going to finish off with a few of the lowier crews, discuss some of the typical crews on board a whaling ship. Mike is going to discuss the hunt. I'm going to talk about processing a whale, so I hope there are no EBGBs in the audience because it does get pretty technical. I'll try to make that kind of quick. And Mike will talk about the end of the voyage, and I'll finish off with whaling wise. We could each spend way more than an hour on each of these topics, but we're going to try and more or less include history as we go along on a typical whaling voyage, so you can get an idea of what the whaling history was really like for New Bedford in particular. Okay, so let's see here. There is a lake in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's called Lake Ladoga. And there's a little backstory to Lake Ladoga, which I will discuss in just a moment. Plenty of merchant ships were plying all around the perimeter of the United States, as well as going to places like St. Petersburg across the ocean to trade for iron ingots, hemp, and cotton duck. Now, we had plenty of bog ore in this country, but it was soft, it wasn't great quality. They were looking for solid iron ingots, which would have been mined along the coast of Lake Ladoga, as well as parts of Finland and Sweden. Cotton duck for sails, hemp for rigging on a ship. We would trade them things like tobacco, wood, calico, sugar, dried fish, grains, and gunpowder. Now, all the way back in Duxbury, Mass, there's a gentleman called Ezra Weston, shipbuilder. He commissioned the ship Lagoda, which we have a half-scale model of back at the museum. Some of you may have seen it. As a merchant ship. Ezra Weston was really incredibly well known in these parts. He had his own boatyard along the Bluefish River in Duxbury. That's sort of that's a different looking place nowadays. It's more or less for recreation. He had a couple of slips. He was building ships. He must have done extremely well because he had the Lagoda Commission on the North River in what is now Situate, or maybe Norwell at this point. I'm not quite sure which. But there's the old Wanton shipyard. The Mr. Wanton was an old Quaker, and he had a shipyard there forever. Eventually, the Foster brothers took it over, and that's who built the Lagoda. The reason I mentioned the Lagoda is that, you know, when I first got to the museum, I thought all whales looked like Moby Dick. I saw the Lagoda and I was thinking, oh, this is maybe a China trade ship or something. I wasn't really thinking whale ship. But we think it was meant to be called Ladoga because very often when ships went merchanting, they were going to name their ship after where they were going. So if they were going up into the Arctic, it might be called a particular name, geographic name up there. If they were going out into the Indian Ocean, they might call their ship the Arab, whatever. But very likely, the gentleman who made the sign for the ship just misspelled it. He got the G and the D in the wrong place. And it's considered bad luck to change a name on a ship, or probably any vessel, I would imagine. So that's our backstory on Lagoda. And if we just move along a little bit here to Jonathan Bourne. Jonathan Bourne is one of the few people in this area who got a town named after him in his lifetime. He was born in a little village of Sandwich called Monument. And as a young guy, he went across the canal and he got a job in a market. And he worked for this gentleman for about 3-4 years. The guy died, he bought the market. And then he married into the Howland family. If you folks know anything about local genealogy, you know the Howlands came over on the Mayflower. There was an indentured servant named John Howland. He got thrown off the ship during a storm. Somebody got him back on a rope. He was indentured to Governor Carver, I think, as a young man. He eventually married and had something like 10 or 12 kids. In those days, kids didn't live very long. But each of his children had 10 to 12 kids. And now there are tens of thousands of Howland descendants all over the country. People like Sam Irvin from Watergate history, Humphrey Bogart, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Alec Baldwin, the list goes on. Sarah Palin is a Howland, Dr. Spock, Chevy Chase, and maybe somebody here in the audience has got a Howland all the way back in time. In any case, he married into the Howland family, you know, long-time maritime family. And within 10 years, he was heavy into whaling. The Lagoda was not any typical ship. Most ships were really ready to be condemned after a certain number of years, didn't have very many years in their voyages. But the Lagoda went for something like 60 plus years. First as a merchant, it was built in, I think, 1826, and eventually Bourne purchased it in 1841, and he converted it into a whaler, which Mike's going to talk about. Just a couple of quick notes about the whaling business before I go on, or Mike goes on. There are two business models that Quakers popularized. One is the lay or profit sharing. So unlike British whalers, Yankee whalers were not paid a monthly salary. They got paid based on the profits of the ship. And it's very detailed, but in any case, the owners got about 70%. The lowly crew got about 30%. Captain might get about 15% of that. And then on the way down, the lowliest cabin boy, maybe 250th, something like that. In many cases, crews might owe the ship by the time they were done because, you know, the profits were made on the backs of these crews, kind of just like in the fishing industry. The other business model is syndication. So you'd have typically 10 to 15 investors. If they had to build the ship, that cost about $30,000 in those days, a little bit more. To outfit the ship was quite expensive, anywhere between $10,000 and $18,000. It was kind of like, it really, if you lived in those days, to run a farm was $2,500 a year, maybe 3,000. To launch a whaling ship was like a capital investment, a venture capitalist project, okay? And so each person would invest maybe $2,000-3,000. It's not a lot to us now. That would have been about $90,000 in those days. So to build the ship, there were 10 or 12, trusted investors. And the stakes were very high. They were going all over the world to uncharted places. There was a lot of risk, etc. We'll talk more about that. Okay, next.
So the whaling industry was full of risk. We've done some investigation, and over a number of years, something like 5% of the vessels never ever returned to New Bedford. Many of the vessels returned with unprofitable cargoes, and the number of vessels that arrived in port fully laden was almost never. Towards the middle of the whaling industry, about 1840, excuse me, my legs are killing me. Do you mind if I sit down?
We are.
Towards the middle of the whaling century of about 1840, whales were becoming short within the region of the Atlantic, and vessels had to go further and further and further, such that some of the voyages lasted up to 4 years. So it really didn't make any sense to go out and purchase a brand new whale ship. You'd rather go out and look for a second-hand vessel, which is exactly where our Lagoda came in. She was high-sided, broad-beamed, and her positive stability allowed for the 60-ton, 60-foot whales to be processed alongside. The job of the conversion was given to a certain Captain Howland. The first thing he did was to have the vessel hauled down. This was to inspect her bottom plates. The bottom of these ships was coated with either copper plates, but later with Muntz metal plates, which is a 60-40 zinc copper compound. Any of the loose plates would be refastened, and any that are missing, they would inspect for shipworm and replace. The bottom of the keel, a full length of pine was attached. The vessel will be going parts of the world that were neither charted or known, in fact, in any fashion, and the chances of her touching bottom were very frequent, and the soft pine would protect the oak keel. Once upright, he built a reservoir aft of the foremast. This reservoir would hold water and would protect the wooden deck from the try-works which would be built on top of it. The brick try-works contained 2 large cauldrons, holding about 250 gallons. In front of the brickworks were 2 doors in which fire would heat the cauldrons. A cooling tank was placed on the starboard side for the oil to be placed in once it had boiled down and before it was transferred cooled into the casks that would be on deck. The main deck, the weather deck, the cork deck, was covered with a layer of pine. This was going to protect it from the sharp knives used in cutting up the whale later on. The section of the bulwark midships on the starboard side was removed and a trapeze fitted. Here they would haul the parts of the whale on board later on. 5 sets of davits were rigged, 3 on the port side, 2 on the starboard side. You can always tell a whale ship in any oil painting, the davits always face outboard. That is because when they were hunting the whale, they needed a quick getaway, and the boats were already slung, ready to be lowered in the water. The next job was to find a captain. It's almost certain that the owner knew the captain. He may have been a family member, somewhere between 20 and 40 years old. He may have captained a couple of voyages successfully before for the owner. Anyway, he was a man that was going to be trusted. The voyage might last 4 years, and there was no communication whatsoever. Having said that, the owner might have sent a duplicate letter to a number of ports around the world where he thought the ship was going. I say thought because he had no idea apart from the general direction. So for 4 years, the captain was solely in charge and expected to bring back a full cargo, a healthy crew, and a good vessel. The captain lived in the after part of the vessel. He had a bedroom on the starboard side. Today, even today, captains' bedrooms on a merchant ship are always on the starboard side. On the Lagoda, there's a small toilet. 1 in 5 of the captains took his wife with him, and that would have been for her use only. He had a day room which consisted of a day bed and a large desk, which would accommodate his charts and be there for him calculating his star sights, as well as performing ship's business. He would have brought aboard his own sextant, and 2 chronometers would have been supplied by the owner, probably rented in Boston. His accommodation was separated from the officers' accommodation, which lay forward of him. The center of their accommodation contained a table. A table was for himself and his officers to eat. It was also shared by the next group of petty officers in steerage, but never at the same time. When the officers joined the vessel, they were allocated one of the boats. The captain's boat is always on the starboard quarter, the mate the port quarter, second mate port midships, and the third mate port forward. Along with the boat, they were given a dedicated crew. That group stayed together throughout the voyage. Each of the officers kept a 4-hour watch, 4 on, 8 off. In addition, they had extra duties. The chief officer, under the direction of the captain, took care of the day-to-day working of the ship. He also kept the logbook, and on a whale ship, you can always tell the chief officer's cabin because it has a small desk. The second mate probably was responsible for an inspection of the sails and the rigging. The third mate, the boats, making sure that they were watertight and that the gear that they would be using was kept in good order. Forward of them lived 4 harpooneers. In addition, there was another 4 people known as ship keepers. They were the cooper, carpenter, blacksmith, and the cook. I will talk about the cook, Nancy will talk about the others. The cook almost certain was a person of color. He may well have escaped from down south, and like most of them did, came by sea. Once they'd cleared the shores of the southern region, they would have got out of hiding, and the captain would have turned them to work. Here they would have discussed their situation with the crew members. They found out that if they signed on to an American ship, they achieved an address and as such, a form of citizenship. Then, when they got to New Bedford, they would be free of the bounty hunters that roamed the streets. The cook was tasked with making two sorts of meals once the fresh goods had expired. The meal for the crew was known as lobscouse. Basically, it was a stew that comprised of desalted meat, which had come aboard in very large casks. This was mixed with dried beans, dried peas, and ship's biscuit, which thickened the soup. That was really the only food that these poor sailors got. The officers lived better. Once their fresh food had finished, they used animals which they brought aboard. There would be goats, sheep, and a multitude of hens. There's even talk of a cow being on board. Once they had gone, the meat or the offals and the bones would go into the crew's lobscouse. Let's see.
Oh, sorry. So another thing that they would eat would be the large Galapagos turtles, because they could be stored on board a ship for long periods of time. They didn't need any water or very little amounts of water. There's one story where they had something like 100 turtles stored upside down on the ship. Really tasty meat too, unlike some of the stuff that Mike was talking about. Okay, so by 1850, there would have been something like 25 to 30 crew members on board one of these ships. Depends on how large the ship is. And as Mike had said, there are some employees who have nothing to do with whaling. If they were lucky enough to have a blacksmith on board ship, he'd be doing a lot of sharpening of tools. Blubber was very thick and blunt, and it would really blunt tools. So they really needed sharp tools on board. He would spend lots of time doing this. There's something like 150 to 200 harpoons that would have been on one of these ships, besides all sorts of border knives and various other kinds of tools. The carpenter repaired whaleboats and anything having to do with wood. If they were bored and they were out in the Pacific and they weren't finding whales and there was a family on board ship, they'd make toys for the family or cradles and things like that. You know, it's kind of neat. The cooper was a pretty important container guy in those days. So he made all of the barrels. They didn't come on board all made, maybe for storage for things like water and food and clothing and so forth. But typically they'd come on board in a kit called a shook, and they'd all be numbered. You know, if you've been down to Mystic in Connecticut, you can step into the cooper's shop and you'll find out just how much skill was involved. It took a good cooper about 15 years to apprentice, because they had to make certain that the oil was tight and that the barrels were tight. And they would often throw water on them several times a week in order to keep the staves tight. There was some loss of oil, maybe 10–15%. In 1850, the green hands, they would have been living in the forecastle that we showed you earlier, way at the bow of the ship. The Charles W. Morgan at Mystic is the last living whale ship, and you can see that forecastle. It's about 14 or 16 foot square, not very large. I would say probably about half the crew would be in there at any one time sleeping. bunks, built into the sidewalls, a tiny little stove and a little skylight, a little tiny skylight above, and they were expected to eat in there and so forth. They would have known nothing about whaling. They would have been lured on board ship for the most part. This is very different from the early days when whaling was done on the shoreline. Mostly started out with drift whaling on Long Island and places like Wellfleet and so forth. And of course, Nantucket. Nantucketers learned some of this from the Native Americans, but they eventually, their ships, their vessels got larger and larger. And what they would do would be to, if they were going to go for a couple of weeks, thank you very much, they might kill the whale out there in the very early days, early 17, late 1600s, and cut it up and put the pieces in barrels and then take it back to the beach and try it out on the beach. And they would have towers and they'd look out for the whales from the towers. But then once, right around 1720, there was a certain Captain Hussey from Nantucket. The story goes he was thrown out a few hundred miles off the coast. We'll talk a little bit about whale biology, but very quickly, they had been used to hunting right whales. Right whales, travel along the surface of the ocean. That's how they feed. We have a couple of right whale baleen pieces up here. But these guys that were blown off the coast saw a different kind of whale. Right whales, the ones they've been used to seeing, have a spout that goes straight up into the air at a 90-degree angle, and it's got two blowholes. This particular sperm whale that they see has got one blowhole, and it's spouting at 45 degrees. And we'll show you this in an upcoming slide. So they think, well, we're going to get it, because it's a whale. But once they discovered sperm whales, that was it. The vessels got larger and larger. Nantucket is very shoaly, very difficult to get large ships in there. A lot of the ships would be anchored at the vineyard, and they take the barrels into Nantucket from there because it was just not deep enough. New Bedford had a nice, deep, protected harbor along the Acushnet River, and that's why everything landed in New Bedford eventually. Where am I going here? Okay, so usually the crews were basically doing anything they were asked to do, clean the decks, climb the rigging, and mostly 4-hour shifts to look out for whales.
So, once on the whale grounds, lookouts were posted. Sometimes it'd be just 1, sometimes 4. I don't know if any of you have stood or lookout on a mast 100 feet up in the air with the ship swaying below you and 3 very large sails, bigger than the size of this room, flapping away in the wind rushing through the rigging, and there's a lot of noise.
Mike, do you want me to show them your picture? Yeah. That's Mike up on a mast along.
It's in my day. It is not fun. And if you believe that your favorite author up on the mast says, "There she blows," it's a load of nonsense. The lookouts were equipped with what is known as a wigwag. Have we got a wigwag?
Yeah.
This table tennis piece at the end here. The lookout would point that in the direction of the whale. The lookouts were only placed during daylight hours. So there would be at least 20 seamen working on deck, either cleaning, maybe off watch, smoking their pipes, and definitely 1 or 2 of them would be looking upwards. He sees our lookout, waving the stick. The end would be a brightly colored or possibly simply white, noticeable. He would alert the captain that there is a whale. The one thing the captain wanted to know, what sort of whale? Rorqual whales, those are the fellows you see with the stripes underneath them, tend to be large, fast, fierce, and their baleen is very short, and they're really not commercial as such. They also have an unpleasant habit of when you kill them, they sink. That's really good news for our men that have spent a lot of time out chasing them. They were really after the bowhead, the sperm whale, and the right whale, called a right whale because it was the right whale to catch. So how did they know what sort of whale it was? Well, when a whale surfaces, the hot air in its lungs, along with mucus and what little water's on the top of it as it comes up, is expelled, condenses, and forms a spout. Each of the species has a different shape. Our right whale has a heart shape, and guess what our lookout did? He raised his arms in the heart shape. Captain knew, oh, good, we've got a right whale. If it was a sperm whale, only has one spout on its left side. All he had to do was raise his left arm, and the captain knew it was a sperm whale. He went and fetched his spyglass. He would climb the ratlins part of the way up the mast and observe the whale to double check. He then made a decision of how many boats would be lowered. The officers who would be dedicated to those boats hoisted the boat, swept aside 2 supports, lowered the boat to the level of the deck, and the gear was put on board the boat. The gear was not stowed in the boats for fear of deforming the keel with the heavy weight of these items. The boats were lowered, the mate in the after end and the harpooner in the forward end. When it hit the water, they unhooked the boat and 2 men came down each of the falls. The captain, in the meantime, brought the vessel such that the wind would be on the starboard side. This was for 3 reasons. When they brought a whale back, it would be tied by its tail to the starboard side, and the wind would keep the whale alongside. Working on the whale, they would be using what was known as a blubber hook to strip the whale. With the sails rigged fore and aft, the wind blowing in the sail kept the vessel upright rather than have it lean over towards the dead whale. But another important fact was, when they went hunting the whale, the mothership did not follow the whale boat. It stayed in one place. The hunt for the whale might take many, many, many hours. In fact, from 100 feet up to the horizon is something like 12 miles. And it was nothing for these boats to be on the horizon and unable to see the whale boat. There may be fog, rain, making sight even more difficult. On the aftermost thwart of a whaleboat, there is a compass. We know the whale swims into the wind. Oh, did I say the whales swim into the wind? I should. Whales always swim into the wind. They'd learned that a long time ago, because they thought correctly that if they swim into the wind, our fellows in the boat have to row. And so it was a case of who got tired first. So the whaleboat chases the whale at 90 degrees to the mothership. It loses sight of the mothership. It's got to turn round to tow the whale. All the mate had to do was do the reciprocal course of the compass, and theoretically, there was the mothership. So they chased the whale. 1 in 7 of these chases was successful. On approaching the whale, they would be using paddles to reduce the noise. The whale was approached either directly ahead or directly behind. Reason being, a whale's eyes are on the side of its head, and these two are its weak spots. As they got fairly close to the whale, there was no talking on board. The mate would make a signal to the harpooner who had the bow oar, stand. He would pick up 1 of 2 harpoons. He put his left thigh into a notch in the bow of the boat. This was to steady him. He picked up the harpoon and he thrust it about 15 to 18 feet from the whale. This is a replica. A real harpoon would have the bark on the shaft here. That was the means of gripping it. He thrust it into the whale, not through it, thrust it into the whale. It had to go through the blubber and into the meat. Attached to this by 30 feet of line was another harpoon. If he had the opportunity, he would take the second harpoon and also thrust it into the whale. If not, it went over the side to avoid, once the tension was taken up on the line, to have this harpoon thrashing around in the boat and possibly one of the crew members. The line goes from the harpoon round what was known as a loggerhead in the stern of the vessel. It's a post. It would have 2 or 3 turns around it and be fed out of 2 tubs of rope, not joined. The whale, obviously very upset, is going to take off. So this is in the whale. The line is from here to the boat. It shakes. It opens up inside the meat. This bends. This was the Russian iron that Nancy was talking about. This is made from the American bog iron, which is soft and bends. This drops out. So in effect, we have our whale on a very large shook. Now, the whale would take off. And depending on what sort of species, sperm whales could dive to over a mile. If that was so, there's 1,800 feet, 300 fathoms of line between the 2 barrels of rope. If it looked to be doing that, they had a couple of options. One was to cut the whale free and let it go on its own, or take the end of the rope and pass it to another boat, which would attach its lines and so on. There's talk, I find this difficult, but there was talk being almost up to 4 miles of rope. That seems a bit exaggeration, but it could go on for quite a while. Of course, the line could snap. The toggle hook could pull out. But let's say it got tired again, was on the surface, and our boat would go close to the whale. Before approaching the whale, the officer in the stern exchanged places with the harpooner in the bow. On his way forward, he grabbed what was known as a lance. Similar to this, similar iron, but the end is spear-shaped. They drew alongside the whale, and the officer, with the experience, he'd done it many times before, plunged the lance into the life of the whale. The idea being now to have it bleed to death. The unfortunate whale would take off in what was known as a flurry, a circular motion around the whale boat. Blood would come out of its spout and it would die, hopefully quickly. It lay on its side and with its fin up, and the expression for a dead whale was fin up. Now, to get the whale back to the ship, I told you the ship stays, so they had to tow the whale back to the mothership. Obviously, other whale boats would get involved, and all together, they would tow the whale back. The whale was tied to a stanchion in the forepart of the vessel with a chain or a rope, and the head was left free.
Very good. Okay, so now this is the process of trying out the whale, boiling the blubber. So we should say, whale oil is used for a number of different things. The biggest market for whale oil in this country were lighthouses. There were dozens of them along the lakes, the Great Lakes, and all over the country. They were also exporting oil to places like France and England to light their streets, because up until then they had a lot of crime in the streets at night because everything was so dark. The baleen that you see over here would have been used mainly for anything that was a tool that needed to be flexible but strong. So mostly they were using it for women's corsets. They called it bone, and that's what gave the corset its strength. This was a big value-added product in the late 19th century. They were exporting large amounts of this stuff to Europe and making more money than whale oil at some points during the market, because by 1857, petroleum was discovered, and they were looking for all other sorts of ways to use, to heat homes and so forth. The other thing whale oil was used for was lubrication. 19th century, lots of stuff was happening. And the thing you have to remember too is that the population in this country was increasing by about 15% every 10 years. It didn't really matter if whale oil was going out of fashion. They just were, it was still in demand because the population was increasing so incredibly heavily. So lots of products made from baleen. They generally would scrape off the black that you see there. It was kind of like, your gum material. This stuff is made of the dentin in our teeth and the material in our hair. So kind of like before plastic was introduced, this is like the 19th century plastic. So brush handles, buggy whips, buggy springs, the ribs of umbrellas, all sorts of tools and so forth. So as I mentioned before, once sperm whales were discovered, these ships were going out into much deeper waters. So they put the try-works right on board the ship. And so when they get back to the ship, what they do is they tie the whale on one end. And the process of getting the blubber off of the body is like peeling an orange. You have two long lances, you cut a great big, what they call the blanket piece, be about 10 feet long, very dangerous, could kill somebody. And then they would cut it into smaller pieces. So it went from a blanket piece to a horse piece, which was like about 5 feet square, and then into smaller pieces with border knives. And the smaller pieces were called Bible leaves. And so the skin would be connected and they would just cut it up like the pages of a book, be easier to throw it into the try-works. Okay. Getting ahead of myself here. So this is the trapeze, on board the Lagoda here. This is a half-scale model. They would drop one of these trapezes. The next thing they had to deal with was the head. So if it was a sperm whale head, there's a whale hook. This is actually a full-size whale hook. This they would dig into the side of the whale before they would cut the pieces. When they were just about ready to cut a great big blanket piece off, the hook would go in again. See what we got here. So this is a North Atlantic right whale, looks very different from a sperm whale, as you can see. You can see this diagram where you have the lines along the body. This is where they're cutting. It's very highly skilled. They're using all sorts of tools to hook into different parts of the whale. If the head is big, and usually on right whales it is, they have to pull the baleen. The baleen is on either side of the mouth, the jaw. And the way, of course, the whale feeds is he's using that baleen to filter all of the little tiny fish that he's eating. And then you might see some hairs on this baleen. That's where the food was filtered through. So little tiny krill and phytoplankton and so forth. But in any case, I see pictures of guys standing on the head of the whale with a hatchet. And so they have to break through here to get into the baleen area and pull it out. Not easy to do with, sharks probably swimming underneath, because now you have a bloody whale and you got a lot of animals down there. And you've got these guys, most of them with braces on so they won't fall into the water, but like everything else, a lot of guys didn't wear braces, Usually they would protect a guy who was cutting with a hatchet by holding a couple of lances that he would lean against, because they'd be up on the trapeze, the guys with the lances, so he could lean against them. But now you've got a rolling ship, right? This isn't in the key area, this is bad weather possibly, so it's pretty dangerous stuff. You can see them pulling off a blanket here. This is a really good illustration of one. Got the hole in the top of the blanket piece, and they're pretty much just, spinning the whale. I've also read stories where guys, if it's bad weather, by 1850 it was high tech. They had chains that they used, and the chains would get all goofed up, and the guys would have to swim under the whale to undo the chains, because somehow the whale can't flip over, right? Because of the bad weather and the chains getting caught. In any case, there's a couple of fellows with a border knife cutting a Bible leaf. Once they got this stuff cut up and thrown into the try-works, take 2 or 3 days, just depending on the size of the whale and what the weather was like. I'm gonna do the sperm whale. So here we've got the head of a sperm whale. There's no bones in the head of a sperm whale. He's a very highly intelligent animal. Brain weighs something like 25 pounds to our 5-pound brain. And he does something looking for food. He is echolocating. So he's sending out these clicks. If you can probably hear them online if you go into YouTube. And the clicks are like a vibration, and they're bouncing off of whatever's in the ocean. And its happy meal is squid. That's what it's going to go for, small or large, usually also octopus. And depending on what it bounces off of, it comes back to him and tells him the size, the shape, and how far away the food is. But we were also looking for spermaceti in the head. That's this waxy material. They made beautiful candles out of it. The reason Mike has a real spermaceti candle there, that's pretty rare. Spermaceti candles were expensive candles. Not everybody bought them. But the reason they were so wonderful in the 1800s, late 1700s, was because they burned very, very bright and very hot. So there was no wax dripping off. You could put them in a candelabra, and you wouldn't have drips coming down on your table. Also, because houses, didn't have central heat, so it would burn below 32 degrees in a room. So you could have a candle going way past midnight and so forth. So that was the other reason, but they were very expensive candles. Let's see here. This is the aftermath of trying out. This is after they've more or less ladled all of the spermaceti out of the head. Who's the smallest person here? Maybe this young gent. They would lower you into the top part of the sperm whale's head, because you were little, and you would be scooping out the spermaceti. And so pretty dirty job, but pretty cool. And there's a third thing that they were going for in a sperm whale's body, and that's ambergris. You folks might know what ambergris is. Mike was discussing it a little bit earlier. Ambergris had this amazing capacity to be a perfume fixative. God knows who discovered it. But they used it in French perfumeries, and there's a black market for it now. If you've got enough money to burn, you can buy some ambergris and sell it. We have some perfume, 19th century perfume that someone donated to the museum. It is amazing. It is so strong smelling and beautiful. I have a young cousin-in-law who came to the museum to get a tour, and we gave him this perfume, and he walked away and he said, "Oh my God, it's all over me," because it just stayed with him. It's just so strong. Because the ambergris is really considered to be the undigested beak material that doesn't digest, because, you know, squids have beaks on them. And the littler squid, you know, you can swallow them whole, the beaks, and the animal would develop like a protective scar tissue around this if you can't get it out of its bowels. And so this is poop, really, and it's a very expensive poop. In 1850, it was 48 bucks an ounce. In today's money, that'd be about $1,500, $1,400 an ounce. So amazing stuff. And if they found a lot of this, they could come home early. Because there was a guy on the Cape that used to, you know, analyze it to make certain it wasn't something else that they would go to. Some more pictures. Mike, you want to get going?
So at some stage, our captain has to decide about coming home. If he was in the Pacific, he may have been going backwards and forwards across that ocean for 4 years. The last thing that our captain wants to do is to go into a port. Of course, he has to go and get water and some stores. But if he spent any time in the port, there's some pretty lady in the grass skirt, and we would lose our crew. So they kept them at sea. He would be getting tired. No doubt if he had his wife on board living in such confined spaces, she would want to get home as well. The crew on those bad rations would be in pretty poor shape. But really the reason for coming home was the ship. Nobody had inspected underneath it. She may have been 4 years. How many of those plates had fallen off? How many worm holes had poured into the bottom of the vessel? No, it was time to go home. At least if they were in the Pacific, it would be a lot easier getting out of the Pacific than coming in. Going round the Horn, going out, they have the prevailing westerlies. So she would be pushed right around the Horn quickly, across to the west coast of Africa, into the Benguela Current, up into the South Equatorial, across the equator to the North Equatorial, then into the Gulf Stream, heading towards New Bedford. There was a tradition that the bricks on the brickwork for the try-works was to be thrown over the side. There was an indication if they saw a whale, there was going to be no more work. When they arrived in Buzzards Bay off Dumpling Rock's lighthouse, the keeper there, with his glass, looked at the vessel, and he would see the house flag. If that owner had more than one vessel, it would fly a pennant with 4-letter flags beneath it. The lighthouse keeper recognized that the pennant meant that his 4 letters are the ship's name. He would go to a book, code book, read the ship's name. Dumpling Rocks initially had a semaphore station, which was used to signal New Bedford. Later on, a telegraph station was installed. The message went to the customs house to the owner. The owner put together a tugboat, they would be side wheeler, paddle wheeler, and a pilot. This was a crowded harbor, and the captain needed all the help that he could possibly get. Before they reached the berth, the vessel was boarded by the authorities to check the paperwork, issue clearance, and to make sure there was no communicable diseases on board. The berthing was usually at the owner's wharf. When they got there, they tied up and a decision would be made about discharge. If discharging was to be done, the barrels would be picked up by the whale hook, the blubber hook, rolled across the deck, down a ramp, and onto the quay side. There, they would be met by a gauging agent. His job was to ascertain the quantity, the quality, the type of the goods that were being discharged. Now we had to pay off the crew. We talked about a lay system. The lay system was based upon the sale of a barrel of oil. When you open your New York Times in the morning, you read the price of a barrel of crude oil. A barrel of crude oil is around 40 gallons. I have absolutely no idea why it's 40 gallons, but a barrel of whale oil at 31.5 gallons, I do know. Barrels wood barrels are all based upon the unit a ton, a TUN, 252 gallons, the size of a wine barrel, known as a ton. Our whale oil barrel unit was 1/8. So that's where that comes from. So the captain would be entitled to about a 10th. A mate, maybe an 80th, all the way down to a 250th for a greenhorn, the lowest of the low in the forecastle. However, before any division was made, there were certain costs deducted. These were things like pilotage, port costs, stevedoring, and even sometimes the medical chests aboard. Then the owners, his investors, insurance were taken off, about 70%, leaving 30% to be divided amongst the crew. As you've heard, the lowest of the low may in fact be paid off in debt and be offered or told that he might have to come back for the next voyage.
Okay, yeah, everything was on the backs of the crew, just about, they had to pay for the stevedores who unloaded the ship, all sorts of stuff was taken off the top for the crews, really disgusting. This is a picture of, New Bedford. This is actually not a good situation because there's a lot of oil there that they can't sell. It's late 19th century. Okay, so talk a little bit about whaling wise to finish up here. Why did women go on these voyages? It was really dirty, long, lots of insects and rodents. Dampness was really horrendous. We have to remember, unlike British whalers, the captain was the physician. So he would have been reading a British-made handbook on how to cut somebody's arm open and do what he had to do and so forth. However, women on board these ships, although in some cases were resented, were very much appreciated at some point along the way because they were good nurses. And it really felt good to have somebody wiping your brow if that's all they could manage to do. Some of these women really knew their way around the medicine chest as well. In most cases, these ladies just wanted to be with their husbands because they were having kids at home while their husbands were away. So one story I like to tell is Eliza Williams and her husband, Captain Tom Williams. They were Welsh. They came to Wethersfield, Connecticut to settle. He was a young captain. They were in their mid-20s. She has her first child, I believe it was Henry. Her husband's home for 6 months. She gets pregnant. He takes off. He comes back after 2 years, meets his first son, Henry. Home for another 6 months. Wife gets pregnant. He takes off for another 3 years and comes home for the first time to meet Stancil, his second son. So I can just see this woman looking at her watch and saying, okay, it's been 5 years now. And I haven't spent very much time with you and you barely know your children. So I'm coming. She boarded a ship 5 months pregnant. She was able to survive 2 shipwrecks and she had 3 more children on board. And we've read stories where, you know, there was somebody who mixed it up, a couple of crew members, and the guys were not able to stand the surgery that they had to go through, but she very calmly held their bodies down while her husband did the surgery. This is newish, but this is the kind of thing you would see in the stern of a ship, 6 by 6 foot, a nice little cabin for a wife to be in. There were a bunch of other guys on ship, no other women, so she'd want to be separated. She might do her journaling on board the ship, as well as play a pipe organ, read, collect shells, whatever. The interesting thing is, I don't think we would know as much about what went on a ship in a narrative sense, unless women wrote memoirs. There are really lots of interesting memoirs that crew members wrote. I think I've got a couple on your reading list there. In any case, if someone didn't get a reading list, we have a bunch more up here. The idea that a woman was expected pretty much in Victorian times to write her own journal. She might discuss with herself her spirituality, or, you know, put quotes from the Bible in there or whatever, but she usually made it out every day. And so we have these very long narratives of women on board ships. Some of it's a little boring, you know, but a lot of it is very, very interesting. Very often these women saw men killed right from the ship. And so they write at long length about what these guys had to go through, you know, for people to eat back at home and so forth. This is Martha Smith Brown. She says, quote, "There are some men here who do not want to work, and I am lazy as any. It's been 3 weeks since I've washed, but today have plenty of soft rain, and I have reveled." Because, you know, they brought water on board ship, and it was for drinking. They had to use rainwater. Usually, Mike tells me they would flood the decks and pump it all in to barrels in order to use it for washing. She also had children. Usually they would drop quite often women off in St. Helena Island or in the Sandwich Islands. They had a mission there and so forth, and sister sailors to look after them. Sometimes not, but most of the time there was somebody around the other end of the world that could help them. This is her home. I believe this is in Orient, New York, and Long Island. Still standing. The Mayhews, lots of Mayhews on Martha's Vineyard. Caroline Mayhew, her dad was a physician. She really understood how to care for people. A lot of folks got smallpox on board ship. She nursed the men back to health. She learned how to navigate because her husband got smallpox. Mary Brewster from Stonington, Connecticut. This is a funny story. They were childless. Her adoptive parents were so angry that she was taking off on a whale ship that they erected a stone in the local cemetery because they thought she was going to come back dead. But she didn't. She survived. A lot of these women would have gone around the world before they went to downtown Boston. There were something like 35 captains' wives who sailed from the Vineyard. And my belief is that the first Nantucket woman to sail with her husband was in 1819, a lady named Mary Laban Russell, but she sailed from Wales, and Mike can tell you a little bit about that. During the Revolutionary period, a lot of Nantucketers was really nervous because they were losing a lot of money. Everything was shut down. And so William Roach, who's the big guy, you know, from Nantucket, who eventually came to New Bedford and set up shop there, he went across the ocean looking for other whaling ports, and they established a whaling port. What's the name of it?
Well, Bedford Haven.
Milford Haven. So there was a bunch of roaches, and Mary Laban Russell sailed out of Milford Haven with her husband. We think she's the first lady, but they didn't call her a Nantucketer because she was living in Wales. This is Marion Shaw Smith. She's my last lady I'll talk about today. She, by the late 19th century rather, would have gone to school. She was a teacher of the deaf in Western Massachusetts. She learned how to navigate, and she taught herself photography. Her photos are some of the earliest whaling photos we have. She took lots of pictures. By the late 1800s, San Francisco had established itself as a huge whaling port. Lots of New Bedforders had offices in San Francisco. That is because lots of whalers were going up into the Arctic to go after the bowheads. This very long piece of baleen here you see is from a bowhead whale. They had really, really thick blubber. And once they figured out how to get through the Bering Strait and pretty much try and survive the ice flows, which very often they did not, they were bringing back for about 12, 15, 20 years, lots of bowhead whale blubber. And this is a gamming chair. So when ships went out into the Pacific, they were going along something called the line, which is right along the equator, going up and down, looking for whales, because that's where they fed. It's where a lot of sperm whales and other whales fed. And so if there was another wife on board another ship, they would haul her over to visit her in this hollowed out barrel. We have a sample of one of these at the museum. Want to talk about this map, Mike?
So the map here shows the disposition of the right whales, the bowhead whales, with the sperm whale. But to me, this is not the most important part. It's the man that made the map. His name was Lieutenant Maury. He was the first oceanographer, American. Unfortunately, he was from the South. Obviously wasn't very popular. But he came up with an idea that if you divided the world into squares, 5 degrees of latitude and 5 degrees of longitude, and you obtained from the logbooks of various cargo ships and whale ships in this case, the position of where they caught the whale, because they would note longitude and latitude, and he took those readings and inserted them into the 5-degree boxes. He's buried between 2 presidents. He was responsible for the charting of the original cable that sent the first Morse code between the United States and the United Kingdom. No one seems to have heard of it. So I think we've just about finished. So
Done.
if you have any questions, we'd love to try and help you.
Yes.
So
If the sperm whales went way deep, what about the other whales, the right whales and the bowheads? How
baleen whales tend to stay towards the surface. They're basically surface feeders, and the baleen is a means of sifting out the food as they progress through the water. They have a humpback whale is slightly different. You probably see the pictures of it going down, blowing bubbles and going around in circles. But the idea is the same. It corrals the fish, and then it comes down and opens its big mouth and comes up through the column of air bubbles. The sperm whale is a toothed whale. The teeth have nothing to do with eating. They only have teeth on the lower jaw. The upper jaw has little indents, which presumably present the teeth entering the flesh of the upper jaw. They're the echolocators we talked about. And they will grab the squid and swallow it.
Yankee whalers were going after mostly right whales and sperm whales. Some humpbacking went on as well. But humpbacks didn't have much good blubber. But along the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, there's a lot of humpbacking that went on. In the later period, early 20th century, now you have these great big ships with chaser boats. And now they're going after all the other kinds of swiftly swimming whales, which Yankee whalers couldn't keep up with. Blue whale, various other kinds of sei whale, minke whale, and so forth. Yes, anything else?
Did, out here, did they set up like permanent, whale processing plants, like up and down Gryphicum, down South Georgia?
The plants that they, initially in the early days of whaling, when the blubber was brought back in barrels and landed, they had houses on the shore, in the towns, and New Bedford had a great many of them. And then, once the try works had been set up, that oil was refined. You do not take that oil and make a candle. You do not put it into a lighthouse. It's a very involved process to try out that whale once it gets ashore. They took advantage of winter to solidify the oil, and basically to just shorten the idea, they would take this semi-solidified oil, put it into Hessian bags, have a very large press with a beam sometime almost the length of this room, and compress these bags, which were stacked one another, and they bled out first the oil. It was done up to 3 times. It's very similar to olive oil in many ways, different classes. And the stuff that was left over, the hard stuff that was left over, that was what the candles were constructed from. So it's a big deal. The answer to your question, there's an interesting story down from from our museum. There's a pub, which we sometimes frequent, on a road called Rose Alley. It's known as Rose Alley Pub. At the bottom of that hill, it's a very slight hill, was a try works for the blubber. And the story goes that the smell was so bad that the ladies planted roses. And hence the name, Rose Alley. But there were a great many in New Bedford.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Was there any specific kind of whale that was considered most dangerous, or would they all just run? Or the most capable? Would any fight back, like the sperm whale are notorious?
The blue whale, the blue whale, the humpback whale, the baleen, the rorqual whales tend to be a little fiercer than the other whales. There's no doubt about the right whale and the poet. The right whale, it's basically a coastal whale, but they are a lot more friendly.
The gray whales too on the coast.
They are very vicious.
Fierce. And also, of course, you may know the story of the Essex. So we've got this sperm whale that's hears some banging going on in the ship, and maybe he was thinking, well, that's another animal coming after me. They couldn't really figure out what the theory was, but he went after the Essex and rammed it twice.
That's what inspired Moby Dick, right?
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. Yeah.
Question. When you say they made the decision it was time to come home, what was their catch? Was it one whale? 5
Oh,
whales?
we get asked this all the time. It's almost an impossible question to answer. We tell everybody 20 whales was a good figure in 4 years. This is not a whale a day business. This is modern whaling, I mean, far outstripped. The amount of, I think it's almost true to say, certainly within a few days, almost the amount that was captured in a year or more with
But keep in mind, there were 350 ships. So there's enormous number of ships going out. So like between 1842 and 1846, there were thousands of sperm whale, like 20,000. But at the beginning of the century, there were 126,000 whales killed by the larger chaser boats.
Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the kill shot.
Yes,
Where's that located?
the heart and the lungs.
And they know. Okay.
That's why the mate did it, because he was the most experienced. And then, yeah, of course, they're cutting up whales and knew exactly where every bits and piece on the whale. Just behind, the area just behind the head. And it wasn't just the one thrust, this was a vicious surgical in and out, in and out, in and out until, if you've got, we have one of these, we don't have it with us. But it has a long shaft, a longer shaft. And you can tell what fishery that was in, whether it was in the Pacific, which the iron at the end is short. And because the blubber in the Arctic is deeper, they're longer. But it was extremely sharp, and that was how they did it. It bled to death.
And the copper plating, that was to just protect the wood from damage running aground or?
No, the worst, wood boat, the worst thing are these shipworms,
Torito
the
worm.
borers. I mean, you get them here on, now, of course, we treat the posts that go into your dock. But there they put these copper, and then as the price of copper increased, they used what was known as Muntz metal, which 60-40. And they were put in on plates, but you don't put that metal plate directly on the hull. They put a felt piece, then plywood, then put very thin strips of pine, and the plates went on top of that.
Does anybody want to know where or if a young female actually boarded one of these ships and became a sailor? So there were a couple that we know of. One was Anne Johnson. She came from Rochester, New York. And the story goes, she was so upset with her boyfriend, he took off to become a whaler, that she decided she was gonna get on board one of these ships. So she came down to New York, I think, and then to New Bedford. And she took off on a whaling ship. There are all kinds of stories about her. She was tall and lanky. She was able to climb the rigging really well, so they depended on her in a storm. And she made a good name for herself. Then one day she got sick and she was sitting in bed and she had something tied around her chest area to hide her breasts. And it turned out that somebody just peeked in and thought, oh my God, it's a woman. And they ran up and told the captain, and they transported her home. She was very well respected though, and I think she got off a ship in Falmouth. She came home to either Nantucket or Falmouth and then was shipped back to New York. It's more than one, I think. Sorry.
Any more questions?
What was your ship where you were on the top of the mast changing?
Yeah, tell them.
Well, I sailed on all sorts of ships, but that was a favorite occupation for apprentices, especially first trip apprentices. Ships have navigation like lamps, one on there, that's one of the foremast being the low one. But they have a bulb, like it's no different than these. So, and it goes, the alarm would go on the bridge. There are duplicate ones, but the mate would send the first tripper up the mast. It is frightening. No safety lines, no nothing. You go up there and I don't know anybody that fell. We would get crew members fall all the time. Well, I'd say all the time.
That's where most of the deaths happened in whaling, was falling from the rigging.
Is that a commercial ship or like military?
I sailed on commercial ships. Now, here in America, you call it the merchant marine.
Sure.
We call it the merchant navy because I guess in times of war, we're affiliated with the Navy, and a lot of merchant Navy officers will go. Naval officers have never been abroad, they just sit in bases ashore most of the time. They don't know the ports, so merchant Navy people have been all around the world, know exactly where to go.